see you all. This is my last book event of the day, and we're saving the best for last. I've been going since 7 o'clock this morning. I've done Q and Marilyn Dennis, and on and on and on. I feel like Canada is mine as of this evening. It's really been a wonderful time. And what I thought I would do before signing books is talk a little bit about the genesis of this book, read a little bit from it. Why don't you think about a few questions while I'm talking? Let's spend about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, yes? Is that fine? And then I'll sign. My apologies to those of you who don't have seats. I'll try to be interesting enough that you don't mind. The preface of my book tells about the inciting incident. Make this a little bit taller. Can anybody make this taller? I can make it taller. I've done this before. The book is, I consider, a memoir, an autobiography, but at the same time, it's kind of a biography of my father. My father was a remarkable man of the theater in the U.S. He was a kind of pioneer of the regional theater movement. He produced Shakespeare festivals in Ohio. His festivals back in the 1950s were created around the time that Stratford, Ontario's Shakespeare Festival began. And I grew up in that world. And it was kind of mother's milk to me. I grew up with Shakespeare, even though I sort of forsook Shakespeare as of age 20. I haven't done much of it in the rest of my career. But the incident I'm telling you about happened when my father was an old man. When he was about 86 years old in 2002, he was very ill. He'd had an operation. It had weakened him and slowed him down, but worst of all, it had taken away his spirit. He was a very buoyant and genial man, and all of that simply disappeared. He fell silent and was terribly, terribly depressed. He lost his will to live, and I found myself in a position of looking after him and my mom for a whole month, and I saw immediately when I arrived that my big job was simply to cheer him up. I did everything I could, word games, crosswords, Shakespeare trivia, prodding him to tell fun stories about his young years, but nothing could pull him out of this deep depression. Then I had the idea, about halfway through my month with him, of simply reading him bedtime stories. I found this old book in his bookcase called Tellers of Tales, which was the very book that he had used to read stories to me and my siblings when we were little children. And just like reading to a child, when he and my mom were tucked in at night, I showed them the book, told them to pick a story, and they picked this wonderful story called Uncle Fred Flits By P.G. Wodehouse. I immediately recognized the title as one of our favorite stories from when I was a kid, but I'd forgotten the story. But I obliged them. I read the story out loud, and it almost exploded in my hands. It was so wonderful and hilariously funny. And about a third of the way through the story, just when the comedy was really kicking in, my father started to laugh. He laughed and laughed. The more that I read, the more he laughed. He was almost out of breath. And it struck me that it was some time during the reading of that story that my father came back to life. That's the moment that started this whole journey that got me to the publication of this book a few weeks ago. After my father lived for another year and a half, much longer than any of us had dared to expect, and they were good months. He had a wonderful ending. He had a good death after that very, very melancholy time. And in the years that followed, my mind kept going back to that event. It began, well, I'm going to read you the conclusion of the preface, which more or less tells you the payoff from this story. if you'll indulge me. Acting is nothing more than storytelling. An actor usually performs for a crowd, whether for 100 people in an off-Broadway theater or for millions of moviegoers all over the globe. Reading to my parents on that autumn evening in Amherst was something else again. It was acting in its simplest, purest, most rarefied form. My father was listening to Uncle Fred flits by as if his life depended on it. And indeed it did. The story was not just diverting him, it was easing his pain, dissolving his fear, and leading him back from the brink of death. It was rejuvenating his atrophied soul. Lying next to him, my mother could sense that by some mysterious force, her husband was returning to her. Before he went to sleep, Dad thanked me for the story as if I'd given him a treasured gift. But he'd given me a gift, too. It was the gift of a father's love. I was 56 years old and had known him all my life. In all those years, our relationship had changed kaleidoscopically. We had been up and down, happy and sad, close and distant. Our fortunes had risen and fallen, ebbed and flowed, rarely at the same time. But in all those years, I'd never felt as close to him, nor ever felt as much love for him as I did that night. He had given me another gift, too, although he never lived to see it bear fruit. The period I spent with my parents was one of the most significant in my life. In that memorable month, that Woodhouse story was the most memorable hour. I'd spent my entire adult life acting in plays, movies, and television shows. I had told stories. I'd had a gratifying, fun, and prosperous career. Only infrequently had I paused to plumb the mysteries of my peculiar occupation. That night, however, everything came into focus. Sitting at my parents' bedside and reading them a story, trying to help two old people feel better, came to seem like a distillation of everything my profession is about. In the years to come, my thoughts kept returning to that evening, even after my father was long gone. Finally, spurred on by the events of that night, I decided to write this book. So that was the beginning of it. It was... No applause required. I set about to tell my story, tell the story of my life by telling stories. I sort of took off from the fact that telling a story to my father had been so potent and so meaningful. So in a sense, I sort of turned my own life into a series of non-fiction episodes that were just as kind of captivating as fiction. At least that was my hope. I'm going to read you one of those little anecdotes just to give you some flavor of what the book is like. The book is called An Actor's Education, so just about everything, chapter by chapter, has something to do with the gradual evolution of this person as an actor and as a human being, and the sort of connection between those two identities. Many of these are on-stage stories, many of them are off-stage stories, many of them are lighthearted, and some of them are very torturous. But all of them are the spine that connects all of them. They all sort of feed into the gradual constructing of me as an actor. This one is chapter 9. It's called Curtains. During a period when I was a teenager living in Princeton, New Jersey, when my father was the director of Princeton's on-campus professional theater, the McCarter Theater. Curtains, chapter 9. I was a curtain puller for Marcel Marceau. For decades, the immortal French mime was a yearly, one-night-only fixture at McCarter Theatre, presenting his delicate art in hypnotic silence for wildly appreciative full houses. On one of his visits, I was pressed into service. I was assigned the job of raising and lowering McCarter's massive red velour curtain for Marceau's single performance. It was one of many backstage jobs that I undertook at the theater for piddling wages, but mostly for fun, during my 2 high school years in Princeton. At various times, I had run lights, painted sets, fashioned lobby displays, and operated the fly lines that hoisted flats and set pieces up and down. But pulling the curtain for the great Marcel Marceau was the best gig of all. I was humbled by the honor. In those days, Marceau was a one-of-a-kind Gallic superstar. His slight frame and unique persona recognizable everywhere. In performance, his face was painted stark white, with his mouth, eyes, and eyebrows delicately outlined in red and black. He wore white pants cut to halfway down his calves, a striped shirt, a tight, short jacket, ballet slippers, and a little blue hat with a flower sprouting out of it. In this emblematic costume, he performed a show that was simplicity itself. He would present about a dozen short mime pieces, most of them in the character of Bip, his alter ego. Raise your hands if you've ever seen Marcel Marceau. Great, then you'll recognize this. And all the rest of you will be educated. Marceau would chase butterflies, struggle against the wind, grow drunk at cocktail parties, or seasick on board a cruise ship, all in pantomime. The entire performance took place on an empty stage without props, sets, or supporting players. Or rather, all of those things were there, but invisible, created by the magic of Marceau's physical gifts, by the eloquent lighting, and by the imagination of the audience. Clearly, the rise and fall of the curtain was also pretty damned important. On the day of Marceau's performance, I watched worshipfully from backstage all through his afternoon technical rehearsal. Although he had been through the drill 1,000 times over the years, his preparation was exhaustive and precise. When it came time to rehearse the curtain call, his stage manager instructed me in broken English to raise and lower the curtain in a steady rhythm as Marceau took several bows. This was known as bouncing the curtain, and it required that I quickly master a complex new skill. In the wings, I stood in front of 2 thick ropes. I would pull on one of the ropes to ring down the curtain, while the other rope shot up in the opposite direction. When the curtain was almost down, I would grab the second rope and allow it to lift me 4 feet off the ground. At this point, my counterbalancing weight would reverse the direction of the 2 ropes. I would drop back down onto the floor and pull on the second rope with all my might. The curtain would bounce, barely touching the stage, then gracefully rise up again. For Marcel Marceau, I was to repeat this maneuver 10 times. 5 times up and 5 times down. It was a tricky business, demanding enormous effort and split-second timing, but by the end of the tech rehearsal, I had mastered it. The evening performance was sensational. Each of the mimed mini-dramas was greeted with clamorous adulation. I and the entire McCarter crew performed our backstage tasks with self-assurance and a sure hand. Marceau had craftily saved his best material for last, and in the final moments of his performance, the audience was completely transported. I'd never heard such an ovation. Then came the curtain call. I brought the curtain down on cue. After a poetic pause, I switched ropes and pulled it back up again. I switched again, ready to bounce the curtain. The second rope hoisted me high off the ground. The curtain reversed course and came